Thank you so much for joining us today. Could we start with a little bit about your background and involvement in both emerging markets and the EMI?
All right. So let me just quickly, share with you that I've been involved in the emerging markets area since my career began on Wall Street, coming right out of my undergraduate days. So I actually was one of the first people who did institutional equity sales, where I actually helped, emerging market companies, more specifically from the Asian region, and within that, with a large emphasis on India and Pakistan. And at the time, there were a few Bangladeshi and Sri Lankan companies involved as well that were looking to grow and needed growth capital. And they were essentially reaching out to institutional investors in the West to invest in their journey of growth. And those are markets which are very, very specific in terms of knowledge base. And the domestic policies tend to be very inward looking. Even now, if you look at India, for example, it is not a large export oriented market. So in order to actually really understand India, the first line of defense is you need an Indian guy to kind of understand India. It's one of those markets where, unlike a Hong Kong, where you don't need to be a local Hong Kong resident to really understand the dynamics of the capital markets there and policy, because it tends to be a lot more global in nature. Hong Kong being the gateway to, the Eastern markets in a sense. India is very different. You need to understand India from the perspective of an Indian. And therefore, as the investment banks started building out their desks to sell research, to sell trading to US institutional investors, I was actually hired in 1995 to do that. So I probably would say on record that I was literally the first specialist Indian, first specialist Indian salesperson to be hired on Wall Street within the context of an Asian desk. Mm-hmm. And I did that, at various firms until about 2004. So I basically helped, basically raise, north of about $10 billion at that point in time for companies within the subcontinent, and, develop contacts with government officials, develop contacts with tons of companies as I basically accompanied them on their road shows. And then I spoke to the most talented institutional fund managers and understood how they thought about these markets. And that gave me a really, really good background to understand how people thought about investing in Asia and within that context, India. So in 2004, I made the flip from what you call the sell side to the buy side at a fund that was very, very excited about investing in Asia. And again, within that, India. And since 2004, I've been on the buy side. So I would say that 29 to 30 years, essentially in the emerging markets area, both selling emerging markets to investors and then myself investing in those markets.
So yeah, could you speak a little bit to how you think emerging markets and specifically India have made progress in the last decade? Maybe we can talk about specific key milestones.
Yeah, sure. So let me first start by saying that what are the common issues that people have with emerging markets, and then addressing how those dynamics have changed and why there is an increased, focus on emerging markets essentially among investors on the back of those changes that have taken place. So historically, emerging markets were thought to be a bit like the Wild West, lots of volatility that was caused by intermittent flows within, into and out of those markets. Emerging markets were a very, very small part of overall GDP, or nominal GDP of the world. They weren't really included in the indexes against which fund managers were being measured in terms of performance. There were allegations of corruption in a lot of these markets. There was allegations of political instability, the fact that there wasn't any significant innovation taking place, and many other such issues. Now, over the years, what has actually happened is, one very important thing was human resource capital, because you had the brightest people in developing countries, going to great universities internationally, and then getting jobs in those markets and not coming back home. So there was what you call a brain drain, as they say. And that was something that I used to see a lot in terms of, people expressing, their lack of desire to invest in those markets. Now, what has happened is that a lot of those things have been addressed systematically. First of all, emerging markets have a, kind of a demographic pyramid that is suited towards tremendous growth going forward. You just look at India, more than 60% of India's population is below the age of 35. So, compare that with Japan, for example, where more than 80% are above the age of 60. So one is that what has changed is that those individuals have become significant contributors to the economy. That wasn't the case, 10 years ago. As those individuals who were 20 and 25 10 years ago now become 35, they become significant contributors to the economy, whether they pay taxes, whether they're consumers of goods and services, all that stuff. What that also does is it actually allows these same individuals to play a very important role in the leadership of these countries. So historically, corruption was a big deal in some of these developing economies. But what has happened is that the younger generation is more of a no-nonsense, kind of demographic. So what you're actually finding is they're voting, and they're voting with their, with their stick. So what you're actually finding is more stable governments. You're actually finding the level of corruption low. And because of the fact that there is a much younger generation of people representing corporate world, innovation has actually increased like anything. And, I can speak to India from that perspective. India is, heavily changed in terms of ease of doing business. So one of our professors at Cornell, at the Johnson School, Professor Soumitra Datta, actually produces what you call the Global Innovation Index. It's a study, and if you see that book, you'll see that India is basically going up, the ranks in that. And even if you look at the World Bank's report on ease of doing business, India has actually increased substantially. And innovation has been great, right? I mean, look at Brazil, for example. Brazil has now become the platform for innovation in alternative energy. Similarly, pharmaceuticals, you look at Israel. Israel has become, the place to go to when you're actually talking about innovation in the, or research and development in the pharmaceutical industry. If you look at India, IT services is huge, right? And today, emerging markets basically account for almost close to 44% of nominal GDP. 10 years ago, this was not the number. UBS, which is a major global investment bank, recently came out with a report. And what they've actually said is that global emerging markets have outperformed developed markets by 1.7% since February. Now, February to May, February, March, April, May, that's about 3 months. So if you take roughly 2% on a 3-month basis and you annualize that number, given that there are 12 months in the year, you're talking about an 8% outperformance by the emerging markets of the developing markets. Now that number may not ultimately come through, but it's something to speak of. And UBS believes that this outperformance trend of developing markets will continue over developed markets. China has a 33% weighting in the index. India has a 10% weighting in the index. So if you're talking about 43% of the developing market index dominated by two countries, where there is a very, very clear view that they've done, or they've basically done the right things to prevent the spread of the coronavirus or COVID-19 vis-a-vis some of the other countries, even within the developing world, then the possibility of them to recover quickly is quite good. And so if you have to make your bet, you have to make your bet on these markets.
Could you speak at all to the role that you think emerging markets can play sort of in this new global paradigm? We've been talking at internally a lot about, so much of our research has been about rapid globalization in the last decade. And, are we facing deglobalization, sort of like a return to regionalism? Obviously, it's hard to predict.
Are you asking this from the question of, on an absolute basis, are you basically referring to it in the context of someone building an investment portfolio? Because let me try and address that issue.
Sure.
For anyone who's trying to build a portfolio, having a presence of any one region without having the presence of the other is not a prudent investment strategy, because at the end of the day, sometimes investing can be a zero-sum game. A benefit of one region is taking place at the expense of another. So if you actually believe that developed markets are going to suffer for a number of reasons, then you need to be in emerging markets to basically hedge against the risk of a significant slowdown in those markets, right? For whatever reason. So deglobalization sometimes and regional specific growth can be a good thing if you want to build a very diversified portfolio, because you can then, pick or, kind of different parts of the world in terms of regions to hedge yourself against those areas in which there is a degrowth taking place. But yes, coming back to your point of whether we're deglobalizing, let me ask you a simple question, right? I mean, to me, the answer is best given with a question in response. Is Coke an American company, or is Coke an international company? Coke may be incorporated in the United States. Apple may be incorporated in the United States, right? But at the end of the day, Apple's growth and Apple's manufacturing is actually coming from areas outside of the United States. So my point is that, one can turn around and look at the fortunes of Apple and say, oh, this is an American company, but really it may not be an American company. Its fortunes may be tied to what's actually happening internationally. So I feel that we're actually growing significantly as a global economy, but I think much of that role is being played in terms of incremental growth by the developing markets area.
Bringing the focus back a little bit to the EMI specifically, do you have any thoughts about what this new environment could mean in terms of research, education, engagement? How can EMI add to and participate in the growth of emerging markets as we move forward?
So what really attracted me to when I was invited by the EMI board to come and join as an advisor was the fact that it was probably one of the few places that created thought leadership through an exchange of ideas between both the business community as well as the academic community. And that's a very, very important point, because we're all operating in bubbles right now. The academic community operates in bubbles. The business community operates in bubbles, and you need thought leadership to emerge. And in a sense, universities and academia basically create the incubation for that thought process. However, thought process in an absolute term doesn't mean much if you can't implement it, and you can understand what negatives or what the side effects or what the results have been with those thoughts. And for that, feedback is very, very important, and obviously the business community provides that feedback. So in a sense, the EMI actually turns around and creates that dialectic, as they say, between the two. And they keep challenging each other. So academia challenges business leadership comes back and challenges those academic thought processes. Those thought processes are again basically altered, made better, and again given back. So there's kind of a thought dialectic that actually occurs between the two. That's point number one. The second thing is that if you see leadership, that leadership actually has to continue. You need the next generation of thought leaders. And EMI basically has, a thought platform that consists not only of seniors from academia as well as from business, but it also actually includes the input of students. And these same students are actually going to be thought leaders of tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So if you actually have that process continuing, I think that's a great thing. And I think that is primarily what EMI's charter has been, and I think that it's been done extremely well. Also, I think it's very important now for academia to have courses that teach students on how to do business internationally, and not just do business in Japan or in Hong Kong or in Singapore or in the UK or in Germany, but how to do business in India. How do you do business in Thailand? How do you do business in Korea? These are all very, very specialized markets. It's institutes like the EMI that actually encourage, a study of these markets to basically allow for greater global integration and, exchange of, thoughts between nations.
So I was thinking about what kind of skills, necessary skills, could the EMI help sort of prepare today and tomorrow's MBAs for what's coming next. It sounds like you have some ideas about, focusing on specific markets. But also I kind of wanted to look at that through the lens of sort of speaking to education at Johnson and how it's changed in the last decade, and also how it could change to address a more internationally minded education. So I don't know if you had any more broader points in that area, or
if you have to basically understand that emerging markets play a very important role, there has to be the practical element of that being brought into the educational curriculum. Actually, being able to take a cohort of students or a part thereof and sending them off to an international location, within a corporate environment to actually implement their learnings inside classroom over there, and understanding, how these things, eventually bear fruit. In a COVID environment, for example, you can understand that this is happening, right? I mean, I heard a few days ago that Airbnb actually had a conference call or a Zoom call with a large number of its employees and just told them on Zoom that they were laid off. You can actually do that. You can do that in the United States. You cannot do that in India. You cannot do that in some of these other countries. Why? Because the backlash is very strong. So providing a solution to a theoretical problem in a theoretical environment with a theoretical solution is all easy to do, but to implement it in real life is a different ballgame altogether. And therefore, I feel that in this environment, we need to basically have more practical, lab time, as they say, spent in learning about emerging markets. And that's why I feel that curriculum needs to be kind of revamped a bit to have more, overseas kind of work experience.
Yes, those are the bulk of my questions. I would open it up to you to see if you had any other additional thoughts, sort of, looking back at the last decade of, EMI / emerging markets, looking forward, if there's anything we didn't touch on.
Yeah, I actually do have a few inputs to provide. The study of emerging markets is a lifelong process. I'm still learning about India. I'm Indian. I've worked in India. I've invested in India for almost 30 years, and I'm still learning about those markets, and I'm still learning about the ethos and the culture of Indian people. Right? It's impossible to understand how a billion people think all at once. So the sooner the study of emerging markets takes place, the better it is. I feel that why focus on emerging markets just when you go to graduate school? Why not introduce the study of emerging markets when you're actually an undergraduate student? So, and in fact, starting that process at the undergraduate level then creates a hook for those same students to want to continue, that when they become graduate students. And that effectively means many of them may actually come back to Cornell to continue what they've actually learned. There aren't a lot of universities or schools that actually have an EMI type think tank or a platform. And so this is a very, very powerful platform that we can exploit for mutual benefit. The students can exploit it, the school can exploit it with students to create a continuity of an emerging markets cohort that continues for a longer period of time. So that was one thought process. And as I said, the second thought process is create a lab requirement. It's critical, to understand how these markets function. And if I have to actually pick a third, I'd probably say, keep that discussion going on a continuous basis as often as one can between the corporate world and the academic world through the EMI. So the more conference calls you do, the more that thought processes change between academic leadership and business leadership. That's great for the world, right? That's awesome for the world.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome.